Let's return very much to our main story. The news that the young economic reformer Mohammed bin Salman has become the crown prince, the new crown prince in Saudi Arabia. Let's talk about this for the next few minutes. I'm joined by Fatima Baeshen, who's the director of the Arabia Foundation in Washington. Also here in the studio is BBC Arabic's Hanan Rezik. And Hanan, let me start with you because you have regularly gone to Saudi Arabia. How surprised were you when you heard this development?
Well, the decision itself, I would say it's not surprising. Mohammed bin Salman has been enjoying powers in the last couple of years. He's been holding very powerful positions. He's the defense minister. He's the one who launched the Yemen campaign. He's the mastermind behind the Vision 2030 that wants to transform the economy of the country. However, the timing is very interesting and very important because it comes in a time where the country is actually facing a lot of challenges in the region, like regionally and internally as well.
We'll come back to that in a moment, but Fatima, we were hearing there, he is described as a reformer. For those perhaps not familiar with him, how much of a reformer?
Well, I would actually classify Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman as a bold but cautious reformer, right? So Saudi Arabia is at a point in its history where it needs to make substantial changes, and somebody like Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has not been afraid to make these bold decisions and also be held accountable.
What do you think it tells you about Saudi Arabia in 2017 that a 31-year-old is now the Crown Prince? What do you read into that?
You know, actually, I think it's very positive, and I'll tell you why. So I think he has a pulse on what's happening in terms of domestic sentiments and as well as challenges. So in terms of domestic sentiments, he himself is indicative, or closely indicative, given his age, to the majority populace. And so he understands how to communicate to the majority populace. And we've seen this over the last 2 years with the leveraging of social media platforms, everything from Twitter to Snapchat. And in terms of challenges, he's been pretty open with respect to the own challenges that he's faced with his previous public sector engagements from the days of King Abdullah and when the current King Salman was governor of Riyadh. And you can tell that he has this sense of wanting to reform kind of bureaucratic cracks in the system has been percolating for a few years within him. And so he's just seizing the opportunity to do that.
Yes, it said there is a new accountability with all of those economic reforms that push to 2030. Hanan, here, that's the economic side. Socially, in terms of your visits to Saudi Arabia, that other area, social change, what is the speed of that now, and what is his role in that?
You know what, Matthew, if you go to Saudi Arabia today, you will see it is changing. However, the speed is a big question. Because there has been changes socially in terms of religious police, for example. Last year, there was a decision to decrease their powers. Now they cannot stop people in the streets anymore. Women's rights, for example, we now see more women in the political scene. We see women in top positions. However, the speed of this change is a big question here, because some will argue it is baby steps and it will take more than bold decisions to go as far.
What about human rights? What about taking on the religious conservatives still within Saudi Arabia?
You know, I'll give you an example. Last year, when he announced the economic plan, the Vision 2030, he was asked about women driving. And his answer was, he said, women driving is not an issue, it's not a religious issue. To the community and the society whether to approve it or not. So it will take more than a decision from Mohammed bin Salman to allow women driving. It has to be widely accepted by the society, and I think this is one of the main challenges he will face.
It was interesting because when Lise Doucette was there only a couple of months ago, she was saying that people there are predicting that perhaps it'll come in 6 months, perhaps in 12 months, but they are anticipating changes in terms of that. Let me go back to Fatima, because let's talk about outward looking. We were talking about economic change, social change. What about Saudi Arabia's links with the outside world? How do you see relationships? He's clearly of one mind with Donald Trump when it comes to Iran, for example.
I think with respect to the geopolitical dynamics in the region, it's going to be foreign policy, the continuity in foreign policy, whether it's Iran or Qatar or Yemen. And I also think that there's been a resurgence, a revival in the relationship with the United States as well, that will continue given the strategic, the alignment in strategic goals in terms of security in the region and in terms of economic alliances as well. But I wanted to just go back to a point that Hanan had brought up momentarily just a minute ago. So I also see the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman he is bold, but he's also cautious, and so we've seen this a lot in the reform efforts. You know, he's not afraid to make a decision, but also at the same time pivot. And this happened last year in October when there were salary cuts, and you know, he was advised against it. He did it anyway because he felt like it was something that needed to be done in terms of fiscal reform. And then earlier this year, when we saw that there was better and I keep saying we because I'm a Saudi national. When there were better fiscal affairs in the country, the salary cuts were reinstituted. So again, it's about accountability in terms of making those bold decisions, but rectifying or going back and saying, you know what, this is not something that we need to do anymore. Let's change it.
How would you assess risks going forward? Because you talk about pivoting. It is interesting because he has recognized, hasn't he, that Saudi Arabia cannot just depend on oil anymore with prices. They have to pivot as a whole country and diversify.
Absolutely.
What do you see as the major risks that face him?
Well, I think when Vision 2030 was announced, people, the business community and the global investor community took a let's wait and see approach. And as a subtext to let's wait and see approach, there were questions around continuity in terms of political stability, given the linear succession line, right, passing from brother to brother. So Vision 2030 obviously is a long-term strategic economic aim. So people were wondering what would happen if, given the political dynamics, if things shifted. And so I think this move with making Mohammed bin Salman the Crown Prince is a signal to the domestic business community as well as international investors that Saudi Arabia is becoming more stable for the long term in an effort to boost investor confidence. As you know, Vision 2030 is a domestic economic diversification reform strategy, but it relies significantly on private sector engagement, both domestically and foreign direct investments from abroad.
Just briefly, Hanan, and finally, I mean, it's difficult to judge this because, I mean, this was simply a decree from the king, but in terms of any sort of public support for this move, a 31-year-old with 2/3 of the population, so young there in Saudi Arabia?
The young people, especially on social media, are very hopeful because he's someone as young as 31, and they're hoping he will create more jobs for the unemployed, and they're hoping for a change. It is definitely a side of a change. But some other critics will say, like, with the young age, it comes like a lack of experience in some parts. So, like, that's a question I think remains to be seen in the near future.
Well, there we have to leave it. Thanks both of you for your time discussing the implications of this